Hello everyone, today's presentation is about English as an international language and English as a lingua franca. Let's start with the English as an international language. For a language to be international, a few requirements have to be met. First of all, the language has to be spoken by a large number of people who are natives of another language. Second, the language has to become denationalized, which I will explain in the next slide. Also, an international language needs to allow its speakers to communicate their ideas and culture to others. And for addition, it needs to become a language of wider communication, not only in local, but also global sense. And at last, over the time, an international language is the one that develops a special role in other countries. Let's go back to denationalization. When is a language considered denationalized? For example, when it stops being linked to any country or culture, and as a result, it only belongs to people who use it. All of that means that a typical relationship between culture and language has to be re-examined. How do we re-examine it? First, with the reference to teaching competence and use of materials in the classroom that should be modified depending on the culture, and at last, the cultural assumptions about the teaching methods, as each culture has got different approaches and beliefs about the way of teaching. There is one problematic aspect that we should consider while implementing English as an international language in the classroom. Which standards should be applied, the ones from the native countries or the ones from each speaker's culture? And another aspect to consider is, which materials should we use? And why most of the materials are still related to the native English-speaking countries. That raises the question if English language meets all the requirements to be an international language, since it's still linked to some English-speaking countries.
What does it mean to use English as an international language in contrast to as a foreign or second language? In this matter, we need to define ESL and EFL. An ESL, English as a second language classroom, is in a country where English is the dominant language. The students are immigrants or visitors coming from different countries in which the language is different to English. The class is usually of mixed nationalities, so students don't share a native language or a common culture. Outside the classroom, students have a specific practical need for English and an ample opportunity to use it. And students have to communicate with the language in many places and in many situations different to the academic purposes. Students have extensive daily exposure to English-speaking culture. Although their understanding may be limited by their language skills, they are pushed constantly to use the language to communicate. In contrast, English as a foreign language is quite different. Let's see. An EFL classroom generally takes place in a country where English is not the dominant language. Students share the same language and culture, for example, Spanish in Colombia. The teacher may be the only native English speaker they have exposure to, and finding other people who speak the language can be quite difficult. Students have limited exposure to English-speaking culture, most often through a distorted lens like TV or music. Therefore, outside the classroom, students have very few opportunities to use the language. And for some students, learning English may not have any obvious practical benefit other than being academic. How is English used as ESL and EFL around the planet? Well, let's take a look at Crutch's circles. In the inner circle, English is the mother tongue, and there are different native accents such as American and British, or any other depending on the English-speaking country. Their native accent comes from free, and there is little or no interest to learn other languages because everybody else is trying to learn their language. In the outer circle, we find countries like South Africa, India, and Singapore who have been colonial countries that have inherited English and still use it as a second language, mostly in media, administration, legislation, education, etc. Finally, in the outer circle, we find countries like Colombia, China, Russia, and others, which are permanently trying to increase the level of English speakers with political and economic purposes. So now let's see the contrast to English as an international language. What are the facts? Let's begin. Well, the majority of users of English are not native speakers of the language, outnumbering them by 1 million non-native speakers. English as an international language is an alternative to the traditional models of English such as EFL and ESL today. The notion of native speakers as owners of English is constantly challenged. In other words, the native speaker is no longer the exclusive model for language learning and use. Jenkins, 2007, admits that English as an international language sits more comfortably within a world English's framework. She called it pluricentrality or pluricentricity of the English, which she referred to the varieties of English outside the inner circle countries. It focuses on a selection of norms from many Englishes instead of a variety of English based only on one or two localized varieties. Therefore, English as an international language is a model that celebrates linguistic diversity, multilingual and multidialectal features, and provides room for the establishment of local linguistic forms. And we have a right to what authors have to say about EIL. Pennycock in 1994 says that EIL is a historically and politically situated occurrence. English is not an international language per se, and no language is. And it's only an international language because it's the product of historical circumstances. Holiday says something similar. The abandonment of the belief that native speakerism should be regarded as the norm for English teaching and its methodology. Widowson in 1998 asserts that EIL means that no nation can have custody over it. It is not a possession which the inner circle nations lease out to others while still retaining the freehold. Other people can actually own it, and it is what's going on nowadays. EIL proposes a model that conceives non-native speakers of English as legitimate users of the language, regardless of where they stand in terms of native speakerism, ethnicity, or even linguistic skills, Seelhofer said. So, as we have come to this conclusion, there is the need to develop skills that allow speakers to interact with international users of the language.
Well, let's now focus on English in Colombia, where Diego Macias believes there should be a shift from EFL to ELF. He believes that English is gaining popularity due to the increase of English language schools, which are in part fueled by the connection there is between the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as the historical dominance of these countries, which are situated in the inner circle of Catru's concentric circles of world Englishes. Well, let's see how, according to Macias, English is associated with ELT in Colombia. First, ELT has been taught in Colombia on the premise that you will be better prepared for a globalized world. It is also taught to help learners pass English assessment exams like the TOEFL or the IELTS. Furthermore, people learn it as a means to further their career and enhance job opportunities. Rendon in 1988 believed that people are more likely to succeed if they're proficient in English. And finally, people learn it to be more North American, and this is what Ritzer calls McDonaldization. Alas, this preference is seen by others as a threat of what Kyung Wolf described English linguistic imperialism. Now, my partners have already discussed EFL and ELF, but I think it's relevant that we understand that EFL is in fact English as an international language, as it carries the same traits of outer circle languages. Colombians may be right to choose English. Advantages of ELF according to Gilmore 2007 include: first, it allows for comprehension of not just one variation of English, thus allowing for a swifter cross-cultural communication. This is the case of non-native to non-native speaker communication. And the fact that if you skip the inner circle varieties of English in textbooks, the balance of power shifts from native speakers to non-native speakers of English. However, I'd like to point out that this may be in vain, as passing a language assessment exam required by many companies and universities demand a high level of accuracy in standardized spelling and grammar. There are some disadvantages of ELF according to Macias. He believes that it lacks a linguistic corpus to support it, and the idea that many native speakers of English still see themselves as the authority in the English language as bearers of a dominant language. That said, the emergence of ELF has made concepts such as standardized English and native speakers significantly more complex and more difficult to divine, according to Macias, 1992. Which brings us back to native English speakers as teachers here in Colombia, with some conflicting views. It is still considered that the native English speaker is the perfect model or norm worthy of emulation. Native English speakers of English might become a thing of the past, however, as that they are outnumbered across the world, according to Gradle 2006. Furthermore, English has developed into many other varieties, and this trend seems unstoppable. In fact, most communication in English is not done in the first language, so it brings about the question of ownership. However, Davies in 2003 contends that the native speaker should be considered not as a measure, but as a model, a goal, almost an inspiration. However, there's some advantages for non-native speakers of English in Colombia, according to Medjes in 1992. First, they can serve as imitable models of the successful learner of English. Second, they can teach learning strategies more effectively, and they're able to anticipate learning difficulties. This is because they know what it is to be a second language learner, so they have first-hand experience of this. And finally, they can be much more empathetic towards the needs and problems of their students. Finally, in the Colombian context, Macias criticizes the lack of in-house learning methods to tackle local language needs. This, I believe, is very sad, as Colombians do not see a need or are encouraged to set up their own methodology, even after seeing that the foreign import has not led to success. This is a valid point, as our needs are different. According to Macias, methodology and curricula should be inspired by students' interest and needs, and the characteristics of their own teaching settings. Interestingly though, if it is taken into consideration that teachers have been traditionally seen as models for students, the ELF teacher should be not only a proficient user of the language, but also a consistent model of language learners. However, what Macias has failed to explain here is what being a proficient user entails, and why this is a need in an ever globalized community.